Disney's animated movie Mulan is inspired by the old tale of Mulan from China. The oldest known version of this tale is called the Ballad of Mulan. Let's see just how much Disney transformed the Ballad of Mulan to become Disney's animated Mulan. Well, hello there! My name's Jeremy and welcome back to Freeform Disney, where I talk about all aspects of Disney, from the animated movies to the theme parks to Star Wars, Marvel, and Pixar, and the TV shows, and everything else in between. And that is why it's Freeform. And keep coming back every day for new daily content. If you're not subscribed yet, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. We've got a new Mulan movie coming out, and that means today it is time for another episode of Transformed by Disney, and I'm going to be looking at the original animated Mulan back in 1998, and also its origins, which are way back, at least say 1500 years ago in China, and maybe quite a bit more. The first written form of the story is in the poem titled The Ballad of Mulan. Now, it's suspected to be considerably older than this, as it was probably passed down orally from one generation to another for some unknown period of time prior to the story being written. Even the timing of the writing of that Ballad of Mulan is a little mysterious. It's generally accepted that it was written sometime during the Northern Wei dynasty of China between 386 and 534 CE, which is a period of time that still spans around 150 years. Now, the Ballad of Mulan is not a super long story or anything. In fact, it's only 60 lines long. It's a poem, epic poem. Now, I'm going to go ahead and talk about how it differs from the Disney movie of Mulan, but know that there have been countless other versions of the story of Mulan made as poems, stories, plays, and movies over the centuries. Well, let's go ahead and jump on into those differences, and a couple similarities too, of course. In the beginning of the poem, we see Mulan at a loom weaving. There's no matchmaker or any of the buffoonery that happens in Disney's tale. There isn't any specific enemy called out in the poem. Now that said, given the time period the poem was written, the Northern Wei dynasty, it was almost certainly not the Huns. Now given that time period, one likely suspect for who the opponents might have been would be the Roran tribes. Now they also are certainly not super evil villains like we saw in Disney's Mulan. Now next comes the call for the army. This definitely happens in the poem. It's an important part. Although one quick caveat, it's not the emperor calling, it's actually the Khan. The title Khan is known to have been used at times by the Shan who founded the Northern Wei dynasty. So there was a time period where Khan was actually used in China. Now, as much as we may be used to seeing separate peoples and finding tons and tons of divisions, an interesting note as well is that it was actually quite the melting pot up there in the Northern Wei. And that's actually been true of a good bit of Chinese history, as other peoples and cultures come in and become Sinified, as the term is, to become integrated into the Chinese society and culture. Now back to that call for the army. Well, Mulan's father is most certainly one of the people called to serve in a great force being called together. Now this is the same in both Disney and the Ballad of Mulan. But in the Ballad of Mulan, Mulan is not actually an only child. She has an older sister for one, and she does actually have a brother, although that brother is too young to fight. Now given all of this, she decides to serve in her father's place. So that's a similarity, definitely. She still makes that choice. But how she goes about that choice is immensely different. She doesn't steal the father's horse, his sword, and his armor. Instead, she goes out and buys the necessary supplies, and then bids her parents farewell and heads off to the army. It's okay. She chose to do it, and they're okay with it. Now you may think, well, that seems really odd given what we know of Disney's Mulan. Well, that's because it's a little bit different. So in the Northern Wei at this time, they still held on to some of their traditions that came from when they were nomadic tribes before becoming part of China. Now this includes training both boys and girls to fight, and that also means that women would sometimes serve in the army as well. There definitely would be no great worries by Mulan's parents about her being a girl, and it also means she probably already knew how to fight and wield a sword. although it's not explicitly mentioned in the poem. The poem goes on to talk a fair bit about her travels and the great distances she traveled while part of the army. We hear about generals dying and that strong warriors return after 10 years. For Disney, the time really feels very, very short in the army. And Mulan in the poem is never mentioned as having been discovered to be a woman, or really that it even mattered whether she was a woman or not. Moving on in the poem, Mulan finishes her duty and the Khan seeks to give her a reward. Mulan says that she has no use for a high official's post or tons of money or anything. All she really wants, simply a good mount to take her back home quickly. That's it. Now this is echoed in Disney's tale when Mulan turns down a position on the council from the Emperor. Although the Emperor still does give her a couple rewards. But the same idea heading back to her family is still there as well. Now in the poem, she finally returns home and she is greeted by her parents and older sister and younger brother. Now this seems to be a much bigger welcome home, given the bigger family, and also the lack of a secret that she's in the army. Then we see Mulan take off her war clothes and she switches back to her old-time clothes. She dabs on makeup, some yellow flower powder. Now, unlike Disney's Mulan, this Mulan does not seem to have any problem switching back to her position in civilian life. No issue of not fitting in. There's no reflection song that would fit into this poem. And then the Mulan of the poem heads to the door and she greets her comrades from the army. And they're surprised that they had spent 12 years with Mulan in the army and never happened to know that she was a woman. As opposed to Disney, where they find out, and relatively quickly too. And certainly relatively quickly compared to 12 years. Also, by the way, this interaction clearly shows that it doesn't seem to be considered a problem that Mulan was a woman. They're merely surprised they didn't know, not offended about it or anything like that. And that brings us to the end of the poem. The final 4 lines of the poem end with Mulan saying this: "The male rabbit's feet kick up and down. The female rabbit's eyes are bewildered. 2 rabbits running close to the ground. How can they tell if I am male or female?" This clearly seems to show us that it's not that important that she was a woman when it comes to having served in the army. They were all soldiers working together. What difference should it make, and why would anyone notice? It's not the point. Now that is a very different tale than Disney's Mulan right there. While we're talking about changes, let's go make a couple other notes. There's no magic in the poem, so no Mushu either. Nor do we ever get a moment of Mulan saving the day, although she is honored and rewarded at the end of her service, so she clearly performed quite admirably. Also, there's no Li Shang, no romance in the original poem. Although I should note there are certainly other retellings of the tale which do include romance, just not the original Ballad of Mulan. Speaking of other versions of the tale, in most of the other versions that exist, it's made explicitly clear that Mulan was already trained in combat, usually by her father. And in some versions, she certainly does sneak off to join the army. Although, while talking about the army, there is no version that I know of, although it might exist, but no version that I know of where she is ever threatened with being killed for having been found out to be a woman. That seems fairly uniquely Disney. Fairly uniquely an American take on it, or a Western take, shall we say. And another note, in pretty much all the Chinese versions, filial piety is a central tenet within the tale, which makes sense given its importance in Confucian teachings, which have long held a great deal of importance in Chinese culture. Now, filial piety, for what it's worth, just to give a quick and narrow explanation, it could be called respect and duty for your family and elders. Well, in the end, Disney's tale is certainly very westernized, and it is clear that it is, shall we say, loosely based on Mulan, rather than hewing a little more closely to the tale as they have done in some of their other movies. And I will say, the Renaissance era does seem to play a little more loose with some of its interpretations, and say, if we headed back to maybe the Silver era of Disney, or some older period there. It's an interesting different shift. We could talk about that more some other time. But while we're talking about differences, it's going to be interesting to see what direction the new live-action version of Disney's Mulan will be like. I imagine it will be more similar and more steeped in Chinese culture than the animated movie was. That's certainly the direction Disney has been going recently with some of its live-action adaptations. So it'll be interesting to see what happens, and hey, I'll probably make some kind of video talking about those differences, and we'll get to look at what the heck they did. Hey, on that note, what about you? Have you seen or read any other versions of Mulan? Are there any elements you wish had made it into the Disney animated version? Let me know down below in the comments. And as always, everybody, thank you so much for watching. It means a lot to me if you show the video some love. Go ahead and click that like button. And hey, it helps tell YouTube to promote it too. Oh, and don't forget to subscribe. And I'll see you back here again tomorrow for another new episode of Freeform Disney. Have a magical day, and may the Force be with you. Always.